All right, we are recording, and I'm happy to be here with Alfie and a couple other folks, James and Richard, who were in our session last night with Ron Richhart. So before we get to Alfie, James and Richard, why don't you go ahead and briefly introduce yourself? I know who you are at this point, but Alfie doesn't, so he has a little bit of background on who you are, and we'll get into Alfie. James, why don't you start?
Hi, my name is James Matisse. I work as a consultant for Big Questions Institute with Will Richardson and Humla Tavangar. I did 25 years as an educator in U.S. and international schools. And I also work with teaching teachers in refugee camps on how to do pedagogical practices. Many of them are new to the profession or former refugees or current refugees themselves without a lot of formal training. So that's what I do.
Okay, great. Richard?
Man, I wish I had something as empathetic as what James just said about working in refugee camps. I sound very selfish. I've similar career as James in education, a long time. I think I call myself a professional disruptor now. Want to do something different. I consult with the IB on social emotional learning and approaches to teaching and learning, which I put them together and call them relational teaching and learning. And I work with a lot of teachers who are under a lot of stress, and that's why I'm here.
Great. Okay. Well, Alfie, again, thanks so much for joining and giving up your time. The piece that you had written recently looks like it was published March 4th and caused quite a stir, as things do on the internets, on the Twitters and the X, was about cognitive load theory. The title, Cognitive Load Theory, an unpersuasive attempt to justify direct instruction. And I know you have long been a champion of student-centered instruction, and cognitive load theory, of course, is one of those things that the direct and explicit instruction evangelists really champion. And you've written some interesting things about it. Again, I'd like to get you to maybe give an elevator pitch of why you felt it was important to write that, and maybe some of the most salient points, if you would.
Why I decided to write this piece is twofold. First, it's a carve out from a much larger project that I'm involved in that is primarily focused on pushing back on the folks who offer what I call the bunch o' facts approach to education, which is dressed up with euphemisms about content-based education and the like, the work of E.D. Hirsch and others, which puts knowledge or information at the center rather than some of the deeper and more ambitious goals for thinking. And at the end of that larger piece, I'm going to talk not just about the curriculum, but about the pedagogy. And so a lot of the people pushing for the bunch o' facts approach are also champions of an approach to teaching that is about explicit direct instruction, where students are basically passive and the teacher simply tells them information and so on, which they're expected to absorb and then cough back on command. So the second reason, besides the fact that this is on my mind as one portion of that larger project, is that, and related to that, is that there has been a resurgence of a kind of reactionary approach to education among certain folks who in certain respects are like the behaviorists. They circle the wagons and offer, in effect, a kind of cult that's based more on ideology, but is presented, branded as if it were evidence-based, or in fact, the only way of using science to understand how teaching and learning work. So I've been collecting evidence for many, many years on the effects of more progressive approaches to teaching that are student-centered, that involve discovery and inquiry, that are collaborative, and in which the point is to construct meaning rather than simply to acquire information or practice skills. So I started this new piece by offering dozens of studies that have been done in the last few years, demonstrating that overwhelmingly the science supports this kind of student-centered inquiry-based approach, with a few asterisks there. Before moving on to one of the methods that the direct instruction crowd use in the face of that evidence challenging their approach to try to justify direct instruction by claiming, in effect, that it's all about efficiency of moving information over from working memory to long-term memory, and there's only so much you can acquire, so it's more efficient to just tell kids the answer or show them problems that are already worked out. And so I went to the educational psychological researchers themselves. I went to that research and drew from the experts' critiques of the idea of cognitive load theory, which I don't believe anyone's ever tried to do for a general audience before, and maybe for good reason, because it's pretty in the weeds stuff. But to demonstrate this isn't something I thought up in the shower, that the experts say, for, as I identify it, 7 discrete reasons, this cognitive load theory does not rest on good logic, theory, or research. And so that brings us back to the question then, if that isn't a good excuse for having the teacher run the show, let's remember the evidence shows that the teacher running the show isn't a good idea for various other reasons.
So one of the things that you mentioned, and I would imagine anybody who is one of those evangelists would be recoiling at, is the term or description of passive, that students are being passive. They would say that that's a straw man kind of argument, my guess is. And, if you look at Rosenshine's direct instruction principles and, iterations, they would say, well, we have lots of back and forth. The students are not just sitting and getting, or drill and kill and that kind of thing. So, like, how do you think about that, and what's the tension there, or sort of respond to that kind of a pushback?
Well, first, the idea of direct instruction certainly does include listening to lectures, and that's about as direct as it gets. Mm-hmm. And even these folks' own definition in their most recent article lists something that looks very much like that. It would be a pretty odd definition of direct instruction that excludes sitting and to lectures. And in fact, that is the dominant approach to instruction in higher education. But I agree with you, not all direct instruction looks like just sitting and listening to a lecture. Sometimes it means working through problems. But here we get to a deeper level of passivity. You can argue that students are active in the sense that their pens are moving, or that they're the ones who are expected to take the step-by-step procedural instructions they have been given and then work out the problems using that. But that is still fundamentally a passive approach when it comes to the important, I think, aspects of meaning making and understanding. And I mean, B.F. Skinner used to claim, my rats control me as much as I control my rats, which seems to me an analogous pushback to the idea that there's no passivity in direct instruction, where under one contrived definition, I suppose you could say that's true, but it's clear who has the power, whose goal is paramount, who is providing information, who is doing the thinking as opposed to merely applying someone else's thinking. So in one superficial way, I guess it's not completely passive, but in the ways that matter intellectually, I think it is.
Mm-hmm. So then flipping that around, and by the way, B.F. Skinner, you mentioned B.F. Skinner, a really great book I'll mention is Teaching Machines by Audrey Waters, and I had her on the podcast. It's fascinating to get into the story of that, but if you've not read that.
And how it applies to a lot of what's being done today in education.
Yeah. Teaching machines and all of the technology that we're subject to now. Certainly interesting, and I did not expect it to be as good as it was, and it was fascinating. But all of that said, so, thinking about flipping that around and thinking about, and I'm an advocate of student-centered and inquiry and all of these kinds of things, but I also find some of the criticisms to be valid in some senses. I'm curious how you define student-centered, and to what extent do you see a role of something like direct instruction, something that might resemble that teacher really guiding and leading versus free school or discovery learning and that kind of thing, which is what it usually gets conflated as.
That's right. That last phrase of yours is very important. And the conflation is not accidental. The people like Sweller and the others who are talking about direct instruction and cognitive load theory intentionally set up their studies so that direct instruction is contrasted with a cartoon version of student-centered learning in which virtually no guidance or support is provided by teachers, and the kids are left completely to their own devices. There are free schools or democratic schools, I suppose, a handful of them where that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Vast majority of progressive student-centered inquiry-based kinds of education environments are not at all like that. The teacher is playing a very active role in supporting the inquiry, helping students to frame the questions, helping students to connect with one another in order to collaborate, helping to sharpen the students' own questions, which is how a really progressive curriculum begins, with what the kids want to know about. There's none of that in any version of direct instruction I've ever seen. And most importantly, even though the teacher plays an active role in framing this, in supporting, in scaffolding, at the end of the day, the center of gravity rests with the students. It's not only their questions often that drive the curriculum, but it's their understanding concepts from the inside out and managing to construct sense around ideas. They're not merely learning how you borrow from the tens place, or a correct way of doing long division or something, or the number of sentences that we're told should be in a paragraph in a composition. The students are trying to imagine what it's like to create writing for a reader, or design an experiment that can isolate variables, or to understand the concept of place value with the questions they come up with. So there's no single fixed definition of inquiry-based learning. I can point you to places where people have given a shot at what we think it is. But the concepts that I just mentioned, in addition to active collaboration among students who are learning with and from one another, plays a role in all of that. Now, in answer to your second question, there may be a role for the teacher to simply tell students sometimes, but number one, not most of the time. Number two, only in those cases where it's critical that a specific bit of information be transmitted, where understanding is not the central goal, but merely knowing something. And even then, only as a last resort when it's not feasible for the students to figure out how they can learn that information themselves. And third, that limited direct instruction in most cases probably should follow the inquiry, not precede it. So that once the students have done the real learning to make sense of the ideas and discover this stuff for themselves and with one another, the teacher might step in to help sharpen, clarify, distill what's happened. But the idea that that happens afterward and almost as an afterthought is critical to the whole project of helping kids make sense of ideas and be able to transfer what they've learned to new kinds of problems and situations. And not only new problems, but realistic problems of the kind we come up against in life, where there isn't usually a single path to the right answer, and sometimes there isn't even a right answer. They're not well-formed problems. That's one of the another ways that the direct instruction people put their thumb on the scale, is the stuff they're teaching in their studies are almost always like math problems where there is a single right answer and a right way to get it. And that's all the kids come away with, even when it works, which is that procedure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that, because I've been in a back and forth with somebody who's actually been on the podcast, and I've talked with and tried to find common ground and instead of, just an argument.
Mhm.
But my assertion is he's a DIEI advocate, and he says, I think lots of what he's talking about is math and right answers kinds of things. And I said, well, so what about, as a former social studies teacher, I might use some sort of direct or explicit instruction to help my students know the three branches of government and the roles and responsibilities and powers and that kind of thing. But then as we get to more open-ended questions, like is his executive branch, claiming too much power at this point? Or let's
Right.
compare our governmental structure to some executive branch in, some dictatorial or other government structures, which are open-ended questions, right? So I don't see how in any way explicit instruction could be the most effective way, because there is no right answer. But then the question was asked to me was, what's the research show that anything but explicit instruction is effective at? And because I say there's more than just knowledge as a desirable outcome, and certainly there are more things than knowledge as a desirable outcome. But what's the research show? And of course, it's a little nebulous. It's a little abstract, because as you say, well, what does inquiry learning look like? It's a little, there are different versions of it. It's multifaceted and it's not linear. And so how do you think about that in terms of like, what's that research show and the effectiveness level, which is different from efficiency, which is usually the standard they're using?
Yeah. It's a fair question, but excuse me. This piece that I wrote that led you to invite me to this conversation,
Mhm.
I think is the first blog post I've ever done that actually, where the end notes are longer than the text itself. It almost begins to look like a law review article or one of Vladimir Nabokov's parodies. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not embarrassed by it either. But for anyone who's interested in the answer to your question, where is the research that shows the more ambitious criteria for judging thinking and the ability to apply information and transfer it to new domains? That's in the studies that I've cited, and also earlier versions of that research in a book I wrote called The Schools Our Children Deserve, which has a huge appendix that's about the research on why kids, why the direct, explicit phonics-based approach to teaching reading is far less effective at helping kids to be literate, and no more effective even at helping them to decode properly. And the same is true in math, that constructivist approaches to math. There's some fascinating work that came in the 80s and 90s done out of Purdue University and other places that showed that when you teach kids the usual direct instruction worksheet, here's the algorithm, memorize this, spit it out on the quiz, and you do it as well as can be done, and compare that to kids who are not given right answers, who have to make sense of these ideas and basically construct what some of these concepts like equivalence actually mean. The result of study after study is the two approaches do about equally well on standardized test measures of just being able to do right answer, get right answers, which is interesting in its own right, because the direct instruction approach seems tailor-made to do well only on that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
You look at these more ambitious outcomes, the idea of kids being able to apply the concept of equivalence that they learned with addition now to multiplication problems that they've never seen before, or take a concept in social studies and apply it to a new kind of question, maybe something having to do with comparative governments instead of just the three parts of our government.
Mm-hmm.
The constructivist, non-direct instruction approach blows direct instruction out of the water. That's true across different disciplines. And most of the people who do this research in one discipline are not familiar there. If you write for Reading Research Quarterly, you've probably never seen the Journal for Teaching Mathematics. So I made it a point of going through one section of the library after another and found almost exactly the same pattern plays out. But when you present this evidence to these folks, it really begins to resemble the folks in direct instruction, just like the Skinnerians are like climate deniers. They will keep playing with setting the goalposts back. They will keep creating straw men where I'm a romantic in the Rousseauvian tradition, they claim, which is simply false, and so on, in order to never be able to do this. And in fact, I quoted some experts who talk about cognitive load theory as a great example, where they got results they didn't want that showed that more cognitive load actually led to better learning. And so they invented a new concept of a new kind of load to magically make the objection go away. It can never be falsified, as a couple of field pointed out. And if it can't be falsified and can explain everything, it can't explain anything. So the real science, the real research, actually tends to support the progressive approach, which, contrary to their claims, is not some touchy-feely, loosey-goosey, anything goes, let's just deal with feelings, which is not true.
Well, I want to make sure James and Richard, they may have some questions and things they want to say. So guys, now's your chance, because we don't have Alfie for long.
James, you want to go first? So
I was just going to ask.
Go ahead.
No, take it. Go ahead.
I was going a couple of things. In terms of direct instruction, one of the things that bringing a human being as a teacher in a classroom is a very important thing to me, and I think to relational teaching and learning. And while I wouldn't call it direct instruction, I would call it modeling of inquiry. Like, so you hear yourself using phrases like, I'm curious about, or I wonder if, or what if we, both are invitational phrases. And Ron Reichart last night talked about leveraging thinking to learning at the point of struggle, the Jeffrey Chopin's work. And I think that can be a very powerful motivator for students to see that it's okay, and a demonstration to go through the difficulty of intellectual pursuit.
Yes, I totally agree. And in fact, I've written on that in a piece called Challenging Students and How to Have More of Them, in which I argue that it's not only useful for modeling the process, as long as it's a deep kind of modeling, not just showing, but explaining this, but taking students backstage to see how I write. And sometimes I hit a dead end and I have to back up and I cross it out and I do it again. That's an example. There's a couple of studies I know of offhand that have shown that kids tend to seem more curious when they have curiosity modeled for them by the adults around them. That's absolutely true. But that's qualitatively different from showing kids the right answer or the procedure. The teacher is always modeling how to be a human being, not just a learner, whether the teacher's aware of it or not. So the teacher might as well do it in a thoughtful and deliberate fashion.
James?
Yeah, thank you for that. I was reminded of a quote by Gary Steger, who said, the most important thing we can do in education is expose children to interesting people. And that, we don't always do that in schools.
Are there people who are uninteresting?
Well, from my teachers, for sure.
But Gary also likes to say, less us, more them.
Yes.
And that's a very concise definition, if you like, for student-centered learning. Go ahead.
My question was, so when I was first introduced to inquiry and constructivist teaching, probably about 10 years ago, the model that was used was sort of inverted locus of control. So on the far side is all teacher control, zero student control, and on the other side was all student control, and the lines kind of intersected, right? So you could move along the continuum from the absolute domineering teaching mode to a mix, to a blend, to all the way over the student mode. The question I have is, have you seen, or is there research as to when teachers are, when the signal, what's the signal for teachers to move more to the left side of the spectrum? Like when can they feel justified in reducing their control?
I want to gently push back on the idea of a single continuum, such that it's not all black or white, but the question is, how gray do we get? There are multiple continua here with respect to how teachers are involved. even when teachers say more, I suppose you could do it quantitatively, who's doing most of the talking in the room, but that's not a very useful, that's a pretty crude indicator. But even when teachers are doing more of the talking in certain situations, they're doing it in support of kids finding answers to the questions they created, not to telling them stuff and making all the decisions for them. That even more active and outspoken teachers who are doing it right are primarily about autonomy support. Kids learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And that's true with respect to social and moral development, but it's also true with respect to intellectual development. So I think it's a much larger conversation about, in this topic, with these kids at this age, when should teachers put their oar in the water and when should they sit back and listen? And that's going to vary. But what is consistent across all gradations of teacher involvement is a fundamentally student-centered intellectual exploration. So that never changes. I have watched very, very good teachers who, for example, during a whole class meeting where the kids are talking about problems they're having, interacting with each other and how to solve it. We're consulting with the kids in their small groups, which in my view should be the dominant default approach to learning most of the time. That the teacher may start out by making sure, I'm going to do some talking here, but even when I'm doing the talking, I'm doing more asking than telling, in order to elicit from the students what their goals are in figuring this stuff out, what questions they had from the unit we just read. And then talk with the kids about the process, and they may have to do less and less of that as the year goes on. Then the students do the real learning with them, with each other, and then maybe there's processing of it where the teacher plays a more direct but still eliciting and supportive role. But again, that will vary depending on all of those things.
Well, I know we've come to the half past the hour, and I know we talked about doing that. If you indulge me in just one question on cognitive load theory, and then we'll get out of here.
Sure.
Since the article was specifically about cognitive load theory, one of the things that people will say that I think is worthy of criticism is, kids don't need knowledge because they have Google. Certainly there's, I think, some criticism that is valid there, because we do need to have some things in our memory bank to be able to pull from, at least in my opinion, simple things like math and that kind of thing. So when we get to the cognitive load theory, it strikes me as somewhat persuasive there, because we want to be able to draw from multiplication tables or some basic math facts in this example, and that if you're really spending a lot of cognition and cognitive energy on trying to figure out and remember things, that it would make it harder to do some extended application of whatever it is you might be doing using those math facts. So how do you think about that, and where do you come in with that scaffolding piece that would allow for them to do that, that wouldn't get in the way of being able to be effective at that application or deeper thinking and that kind of thing?
Well, when I want to do deeper thinking, if I don't have room in my working memory to do that and memorize the stuff I'm applying, I don't memorize it. I call it up when it's necessary. If kids can't keep the multiplication table in their working memory at the same time that they're trying to do real math, then put the multiplication table in front of them instead of making them memorize it. If they really use it a lot and need it, they will tend to learn it without having to make a concerted effort to learn it by rote. The stuff that has to be learned by rote is the stuff that we tend not to need as much. So that's not an argument for direct instruction of working out the problems. That's an argument against the memorization of the so-called basics that traditionalists claim that we have to have crammed into our working memory. I mean, one of the points made by one of the experts critically looking at cognitive load theory is that in all sorts of ways, we make allowances and offer accommodations to ourselves, like giving ourselves more time, like writing stuff down so we don't have to remember that part and can look at it later, and so on. The studies that claim to show cognitive load theory matters and direct instruction is useful deliberately exclude those realistic accommodations that we make all the time in real life in order to make it look like cognitive load is more of an onerous burden than it really has to be, and to make direct instruction look more necessary than it really is.
Well, there's so many more questions and things we could talk about, but since I promised you 30 minutes, we are at the end of that 30 minutes, and I do appreciate you joining us, and James and Richard for joining us. And as folks may listen to or watch the playback, they find it helpful. So go to ThoughtStretchers.org and join the community if you are interested in more conversations like this. And thanks again, Alfie.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate
Bye
it.
to all.
Bye. Thanks, Drew, for hosting.
Thanks.